Now, I've mentioned it before, but all Indonesians have to have one of 6 Western religions, for want of a better way. Well, no, they're not Western. One of 6 formal religions listed on their identity card. And you must choose one. I suppose that does mean that some people are formally listed as having a religion and don't really have it. But in fact, Indonesia is a very religious country. So most people take it quite seriously, what's on their identity card. However, these religions are as much an attempt to integrate or fall into place with the outside world as they are the true beliefs of Indonesians. Indeed, an awful lot that I'm going to talk about today is how Westerners pigeonhole Indonesians into these religions and then go off on a fantasy about what Indonesians believe and attack them for beliefs that they simply don't hold. And I'll talk about that at length later. What is apparent is that actually beneath these religions, almost all Indonesians hold what I guess is best described as an animistic belief system, a belief in the spirits of natural things. And now, today I'm going to talk about Kejawen, but on other vlogs I've talked about Sunda Wewitian, I've talked about the Batak religion, the Dayak religion. So there are many others, even Christian Indonesians may not have a name. Oh, the Bataks do. And the Bataks are largely Christian. Some may not even have a name for what this alternative belief system is. But they will hold these sort of animistic-ish beliefs. And that runs throughout all of Indonesia. So actually, despite Indonesia being a majority Muslim country, the majority of people, I would argue, are animistic. Because of, to a certain degree, these are beliefs, and religion is sort of promoted, through having it on your identity card. Often these beliefs are seen as being backward. They're not promoted, they're not given names. So few people might even agree with me that the belief system is animistic. But if questioned, they will talk about spirits of natural objects or of God's creation. Also, all Indonesians have to believe in a single God. Now that may seem strange to you because, as you probably know, 1%, maybe more, of Indonesians are Hindu. But Hindus often do believe in a single God. Some don't. And, there's a bit of mental gymnastics amongst those who in Indonesia who don't. But in general, many Hindus can subscribe to the idea of a single deity. And again, that flies in the face of how the West seeks to define religions and define them in certain ways. In order to explain that, I'd liken maybe the gods more, what we call gods in Hinduism, as closer to angels or saints in Western religions. So I don't think it's as strange as it first sounds, but confuses the hell out of most Westerners. Now, this common belief system actually unites Indonesians because they have this underlying common belief system. And as I say, it may have different names and it may vary slightly across Indonesia, but there is a common belief system. And that means that, yes, of course, there are religious differences in Indonesia, particularly given that it's so religious. they're nothing like as pronounced as one finds, for example, in the West. Despite Westerners trying to make a big deal of there being huge religious divisions in Indonesia, and there simply aren't, and that's because this underlying philosophy is more important. Indeed, the underlying philosophy and freedom of religious expression is enshrined in the Constitution. Now, I don't want to say too much about that, but it is absolutely a part of Indonesian life. What it also means is, I've hinted at it, that there's this common belief system. When I go to, say, Manado, which is largely Christian, or Bali, which is largely Hindu, I find great commonality in beliefs as opposed to great divisions. But the same is true in other parts of Southeast Asia. So when I go to Thailand, which is largely Buddhist, again I find that same underlying belief system. Now you could say that it's a Hindu-Buddhist tradition, coming from Shaivite traditions, although in Thailand it isn't of a Shaivite origin. I think that it does belie the syncretism of these cultures in Southeast Asia, but in particular the communal aspects of a rice culture which is common across them. So Kejawen welcomes people of any religion and denomination. Theoretically, I think it could welcome atheists, but I think there'd be some mental gymnastics if there wasn't a belief in a creator. And a bit like Balinese Hindus, they would have to somehow accept that it's a single creator. Thus, Parkano, my guru, well, he's Catholic, and it would be and certainly he's Kejawen. He comes from nobility, from the Kraton in Yogyakarta, and indeed many nobles from the Kraton are Catholic. But equally, I could see how it'd be very easy to combine Kejawen with Hindu beliefs, and indeed there's a lot of Hinduism within Kejawen, and that's why I find this commonality when I go to Bali, as indeed there is a lot of Buddhist beliefs. In fact, I think the Buddhist philosophy is probably the dominant underlying philosophy across all of what I describe as this common belief system. Now, when I visit Bali, I'm often somewhat challenged by fellow Westerners, often Australians, and, God bless them. There was an atrocity in Kuta and they're very mindful of it. But they recount to me how the Balinese are distinctly different from the Javanese. And that's because there is a major cultural difference because of religious differences. And in fairness to them, I have heard such things repeated by the Balinese. And at the nub of this is the idea that the Balinese are completely different people because they're Hindus. But the truth is, the vast majority of Balinese are originally Javanese, who came there during the Majapahit era, and particularly at the end of the Majapahit era, so that they could continue with their old religious practices. And then again later, there was enforced conversion by the Dutch to Islam, and that caused people from East Java to move to Bali. So the majority of people living in Bali are actually, who call themselves Balinese, are actually originally Javanese. In addition, as I say, there's this underlying belief system, which, as I've said, particularly in terms of Kejawen, it comes from the Majapahit beliefs. So the Kejawen and the Balinese belief systems are very, very similar indeed. Yes, they've diverged, as you might expect, but there's a massive commonality and a massive syncretism. The other thing, that, and I've hinted at it here, is that some Balinese did flee to Bali from Java because they were being forced to convert to Islam. But that was by the Dutch. It wasn't by Arabs, as is commonly suggested. Indeed, Islam largely came to Indonesia from Indian and Chinese traders. There were some Arab traders, particularly from the Hadramaut, but it was peaceful. It was peaceful. I'm not saying there were no wars going on at the time, but there was no real forced conversions. And this concept of a forced conversion is often backed up by complete misquoting and misreading of Al-Quran, suggesting that it's more violent than other scriptures. And in fact, it's far less so. So I'm told that Islam is a religion of violence, largely by these Australians, when that's far from the truth. Far from the truth. Now, we could get into arguments about recent atrocities, etc., etc., etc. But that's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to look at how Kejawen is relevant to contemporary society. And now, one such Arab that is credited with helping to bring Islam to Indonesia is the Persian Sheikh Subakir, acting on behalf of the Ottoman Sultanate at the time. But he was specifically charged with doing it peaceably. And it's said that he fought with Sabdo Palan, who is often convoluted with Semar Messam. And in the end, Sheikh Subakir won, and Sabdo Palan said, well, he made certain conditions that Java could now become Muslim. But those conditions were that the rulers, the main conditions were that the rulers would always rule with an even hand and not be greedy. And that if they were to become authoritarian and greedy, then Java would revert back to its Shavist tradition. Now, how that's really interpreted in Java is, and regardless of Sabdo Palan, whenever there's a natural disaster, it's seen that the spirits of the natural things, such as the sea, etc., are unpleased with the way things are going in Indonesia, i.e. the rulers are becoming too authoritarian and greedy. But it's often as a shorthand, it's said that it's the wrath of Sabdo Palan. This story of Sabdo Palan is very, very critical to Kejawen believers, but to most Indonesians, and it is seen as a break against tyranny in our country. And it was repeated to me as being a curse. And I don't see it as a curse at all, but a promise. But the person who was repeating it was claiming to be a Chinese Indonesian now living in Australia, but whose family had escaped persecution from Java to Bali. And he repeated the claims that Javanese Muslims were becoming increasingly intolerant, and that people in places like Bali were fearful. And of course, that there always is animosity in Indonesia towards the Javanese, because they do dominate politics and everything in Indonesia, because they are by far the most populous of the ethnicities. But, you know, he was fabricating information, such as saying that much of Indonesia is under Sharia. Well, only a small province, Aceh, is under Sharia. Completely fabricating information and stirring up trouble. Now, because Kejawen is based on 7 veils of truth or reality, and each builds on the last, but doesn't correspond at all to the last, it means that us practitioners don't take anything at face value. Now, I should add that this was on a channel, not my channel, where I came across this supposed Chinese Indonesian. But I quickly spotted that he had a Hebrew name. And now I guarantee that not a single Chinese Indonesian would have a Hebrew name, nor would know any Hebrew. In fact, I very much doubt that those small number of Jews living in Minahasa would have Hebrew names or know much Hebrew. So he clearly wasn't who he was purporting to be. What I would say is I'm not entirely certain that that Hebrew name was not another foil, because he made a big point of how liberal the Hindus in Bali are, and by and large they are fairly liberal, but also what a wonderful country the UK was for electing Rishi Sunak, an Indian Hindu, as its Prime Minister. So, as I say, I don't believe for 1 minute that he's Chinese Indonesian. I doubt if he's living in Australia. And, you know, there are 2 likely candidates of where he's from. But I also believe that I was probably dealing with more than one person, and they were taking it in turns to post the responses from a single account, because it was going on 24 hours. And so I strongly suspect that this person was a state actor from one of those countries. And, you know, Kejawen teaches us that that is an absolutely despicable thing to be doing, to be creating trouble in other countries, or amongst other people, maybe for your own benefit, goodness knows why. But it's a despicable thing to be doing, and I'm sure you agree with me on that one. It is a terrible thing that this person was doing. There were other comments, I don't think from him, but, you know, often they work in teams, but other comments about why Bali was a tourist paradise, as it were, and Java wasn't. And they were saying it's because nobody wants to listen to the Azan 5 times a day and be woken up in the early morning. Nobody wants to see women in jilbabs or hijabs. And, you know, people like to be able to get a drink. Well, you know, yes, you can get a drink anywhere in Bali, and you can't get a drink in small villages in Java. But there's an awful lot of Muslims in Bali, and I particularly choose to be close to a masjid or mosque in Sanur, where I can hear the Azan. And there's loads and loads of people from Java, women from Java in jilbabs in Bali. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're grossly offended at seeing women in jilbabs, grossly offended by hearing the azan 5 times a day, and have to have a drink even when you're in a small village, Java probably isn't for you. But I smell a distinct rat with these posts. I don't know about you. Because there are 7 contradictory veils within Kejawen, nothing should be taken literally. Nothing at all. Because there is no reality. There's 7 veils to reality. So the story of Sabdo Palon is a metaphor, but it's a very, very important metaphor. What my own personal belief is that the universe seeks balance. And therefore, when things go astray, the universe does create natural disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, etc., etc., just in order to create that balance. Now, it feels to me that we're going through an awful lot of activity at the moment. I've described it as a mini Kali Yuga. I don't think I need to get into that. It's just a description I'm using. But I've been ill for about 2 years now. Very ill, in fact, for about 2 years. That in February I even had a heart attack. But everyone around me is also ill. And people have been dying as well. And the strange thing is, my wife seems to be suffering from similar, almost identical things to me, as are my 2 stepdaughters. But it goes much further, people I hardly know are very ill, and often with the same thing as well. I don't think it's a mystery disease. I think it is this, what I call mini Kali Yuga. So why should the universe or the earth be reacting like this? Well, let's face it, there's been incredible deception during the health crisis. No more so than in Bali. Deception and massive, massive greed. You only have to look at what's happened to Bali to see that greed. Now, it's gone on all over the world. I'm not singling out Indonesia, but that would be a reason for what I've described as a mini Kali Yuga occurring. So this metaphor of Sabdo Palon is massively important to us. Now, of course, this would be a fitting end to this vlog, and it was going to be. But just as I was making it, I came across an article in the Jakarta Post that talked about the wisdom of Java and listed various Javanese sayings and showed how they're still so relevant today. The first one is Senjara Tapa Wiyata, graduates without learning. Now, I need to say that this was almost certainly written by an academic, and there's been something of a scandal in Indonesia of political figures being awarded PhDs by the University of Indonesia for seemingly doing no work. And so the article was bemoaning how academic titles shouldn't be debased in that way because it degrades public trust in the institutions. Now, I think it goes much further than that. If we think of what happened during the health crisis, our whole public trust in the professions, in learning, in authority has been completely eroded. The next one is Gendika Tampa Pangrahita, speaking without thought. And, he's saying that, well, this is exactly how political and official discourse is characterised now. press conferences and statements issued to the media that are rehearsed, but the words themselves are meaningless, We can all see through it. And, I've had a run-in, you may know, recently with my solicitor, and they kept using statements like your best interests at heart, when blatantly it was the exact opposite. And I think we've had enough of that. The next one he talks about is kuasa tanpa prabawa, authority without traction. And that's about those who take power, who seek power, take power, and authority, but without real responsibility, that they don't understand the deeper dependency there is on those people that they're meant to be serving. And of course, there's another sort of tradition in Java that there's no point in having power unless you abuse it. And I think he's really getting at that. Merasa tanpa degduga, extraction without foresight. And that is the sort of, he sees it as a celebration of business or economic models which mask the truth. Increasingly, and many people throughout my academic life believed me to be an economist, but many people assume me to be an economist. But I'm increasingly seeing the whole of economics, all of economics, as really just being an excuse for the rich to become richer and the poor poorer. And he talks of it in terms of how micro enterprises, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, how, particularly in Indonesia, but I think it occurs everywhere, their margins have disappeared, their markets have been destroyed by competition from bigger players. So in our village, for example, where we used to get water from a local store, but the company Aqua, the monopoly supplying the water, have taken his contract away from him, so he can no longer supply it. So the only way we can get it now is by ordering it online from one of the C stores, and they'll only deliver 2 at once. So it makes us very vulnerable. It makes us very vulnerable to having to be able to do things online. Makes us very vulnerable to having to pay electronically. All these things could be turned off at a click of a switch. So it's not in the interest of the public, these things that are going on. And that is what Kejawen teaches modern man.